is that, in fact, there's been major labor upheaval in China just in the last couple of months. All those people who have been producing Toyota and Honda parts and parts for American companies have been organizing and striking, and actually the wages in China have been going up 15% a year for the last couple of years. So there's a saying, what goes around comes around. You can see the race to the bottom, but you can see, just as the labor movement in the United States eventually halted the race to the bottom and eventually halted the playing off of one group of workers against another group of workers within our country. Of course, it's come back now, but for more than 50 years they stopped that. And we can see the beginnings of workers doing that today on a global scale. Now, another thing in common between 1877 and today is the end of that period of rapid growth and the rise of a period of mass unemployment. We've seen the people who are participating in a lot of the activities in 1877 were workers who had lost their jobs, were desperate, and were supporting the railroad workers and the other employed workers. That's something we're yet to seeing a class struggle response to the situation we face today on a large scale, and that's one of the things that people should be thinking about. Another common aspect is the idea that labor was just a commodity, just something that could be bought and sold, versus the idea of workers as human beings. Through the Civil War, the dominant ideas in the United States had been the idea of what's sometimes called republicanism, an idea of citizenship. Of course, there was a totally racist interpretation of that, in which people of African descent were defined as non-citizens and therefore outside the role of the role of citizen, and women, of course, were excluded from the vote and also other forms of political participation, and were excluded from citizenship. But the dominant ideology was one of citizenship. In the period preceding 1877, there had been a shift to something that we would very much recognize today, an ideology of political economy, of free markets, of the idea that there are no rights except the right to property. The right to free contract was the only right that really mattered. And this is so similar to the ideology that we've seen arise in the United States in the last 20 years. We hear it called often neoliberalism. We hear it called, it often comes attached these days to tea bags. And the idea that workers have rights, that workers are human beings, not just bearers of a commodity labor to be bought and sold, is an idea that has become denied in the same way that it was denied in the 1870s. That's about how far back we've gone. And as a matter of fact, if you listen to the speeches of the Tea Party candidates, you will hear, it's like Rand Paul would be an example, you will hear essentially a description of America in the 1870s as their ideal of what they would like to take us back to. I guess the word reactionary has a place. We see the things that go along with this very much. One is the rise of contingent work and the loss of any kind of job security. The destruction of social rights and the idea that health care and Social Security, I see now that there's going to be a big drive against Social Security is the next item on the right-wing agenda. And especially similar to the 1870s, there was essentially no public support for people who had lost their jobs. And we're seeing that with the attack on unemployment compensation now going on in Congress in the attempt to cut it off. Exactly an attempt to create the situation that existed in the 1870s, where there was no support for those who had been pushed onto the scrap heap by a failing economic system. Another similarity is the decline of the labor movement. Interestingly, before 1873, there had been 30 trade unions in the United States. It's often forgotten that there was a big labor movement in the United States in the 19th century. It kept getting knocked out and getting slugged, but it kept rising again. And before the Depression of 1873, there were 30 trade unions. By 1877, there were only 9. And we see a very similar situation today, in which 40 or 50 years ago, we had more than a third of all workers were in unions. In the private sector, it's now down to around 10%.